Some people don't lose others, they quietly remove them, one by one, like pulling threads from a sweater that once kept them warm, until all that's left is silence. And if that feels familiar, it's not because you're cold or heartless or incapable of love. It's because somewhere along the way, connection stopped feeling safe. There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from realizing that being around people feels heavier than solitude. Conversations feel like obligations. Replies feel like performances. And slowly, without announcing it, you begin to disappear from everyone's life, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. You don't block people in a dramatic moment. You don't shout or explain. You just stop reaching, stop replying, stop showing up, and in your mind, it feels justified. Because you remember every moment you felt unseen, every time your words were ignored, every time you had to shrink yourself just to be accepted. So you build what feels like protection. But what is it really? It's what psychologists might call an invisible wall, but it doesn't appear overnight. It's built slowly, brick by brick, from something much quieter, something almost invisible, emotional micro-trauma. Not the kind of trauma people easily recognize. Not the loud, obvious kind, but the small, repeated moments that teach you one thing over and over again. That your presence is optional, that your feelings are too much, or worse. That they don't matter at all. Maybe it started in childhood where love was inconsistent. Where attention came and went like unstable weather. One day you were appreciated, the next, ignored. And without realizing it, your mind began trying to solve an impossible equation. How do I stay loved without being too much? So you adapted. You became quieter, more observant. You learned to read moods, to predict reactions, to adjust yourself before anyone could reject you. You became emotionally self-sufficient. Not because you wanted to, but because you had to. And that's where the seed was planted, because when a child learns that connection comes with uncertainty, they don't stop needing love. They just stop trusting it. Fast forward to now, and that same pattern continues, just in a different form. You meet people. You try. You give pieces of yourself, but the moment something feels off, even slightly, your mind doesn't see it as a small issue. It sees it as confirmation. Proof that history is repeating itself. So instead of confronting it, instead of risking vulnerability, you retreat. And the strange part is, it feels like control. Cutting people off gives you something you didn't have before: power over the ending. You don't wait to be abandoned, you leave first. You don't wait to be misunderstood, you disappear before it happens. It feels safer that way. But safety can be deceptive, because what you're really doing isn't just avoiding pain, you're avoiding uncertainty. And uncertainty is the very space where real connection exists. So without realizing it, you're not just cutting off people, you're cutting off the possibility of being seen in a way you've always needed. And here's where it gets even deeper. There's something called ambiguous loss. A kind of grief that doesn't have closure. It's when someone is physically present, but emotionally unavailable. Or when you lose connection without understanding why. If you've experienced this repeatedly, your brain starts to associate relationships with confusion instead of clarity. You don't just fear losing people, you fear not understanding why they left, or why they changed. So now, cutting people off becomes a way to avoid that confusion. If you're the one who leaves, at least the story makes sense. At least there's an ending you can control. But control comes at a cost, because every time you walk away without explanation, every time you convince yourself that you're better off alone, you reinforce a deeper belief. One that often goes unnoticed. That no one will ever truly understand me. And once that belief settles in, it changes everything. You stop trying to explain yourself. You stop giving people chances to show up differently. You assume disconnection before it even happens. It's not arrogance. It's not indifference. It's protection. But protection, when it becomes a pattern, slowly turns into isolation. And isolation has a way of reshaping your identity. At first, it feels like peace, no drama, no expectations, No emotional risk, just quiet. But over time, that quiet starts to echo. You begin to miss things you can't quite name. Not specific people, but the feeling of being understood, of laughing without overthinking, of being able to exist without guarding every word. And yet, even when you feel that emptiness, reaching out feels harder than staying alone. Because there's another layer to this. When you cut people off repeatedly, you start associating closeness with eventual disappointment. So even when someone genuinely cares, your mind stays alert, waiting for the moment it all goes wrong. You analyze their tone, their timing, their effort, and the moment something doesn't match your expectations, even slightly, it triggers something deeper. Not anger, but confirmation. There it is again, and instead of communicating it, you withdraw, not because the situation is beyond repair, but because your nervous system has already decided that it's safer to leave than to stay and risk being hurt in a familiar way. This is what emotional conditioning looks like. It's not logical, it's not always fair, but it's consistent. And consistency feels like truth, even when it's built on past wounds. So from the outside, it looks like you're someone who doesn't need anyone. Independent, detached, self-contained. But on the inside, it's something else entirely. It's someone who learned that needing people comes with a cost, and decided, quietly, to stop paying it. And maybe the hardest part of all this is that no one really notices the full story. They just see the distance. They see the silence, the unread messages, the missed calls, the absence, and they label it. They changed. They don't care. They're cold. But what they don't see is the history behind that silence. They don't see the younger version of you, trying, hoping, adjusting, only to feel like it was never enough. They don't see how many times you stayed when it hurt, before you learned that leaving feels easier. So now, every disconnection feels like a quiet continuation of something that started long ago. Not dramatic, not loud, just familiar. And maybe that's the real tragedy of it. Not that you cut people off, but that somewhere deep down you started believing that this is the only way relationships can end. But when something feels like the only way, it usually means something inside you was never given another option. And the consequences don't arrive all at once. They unfold quietly. At first, it feels like relief. Fewer people, fewer problems, no emotional noise, no misunderstandings to untangle. Just you and the calm you fought so hard to protect. But over time, that calm begins to change its shape. It becomes heavier. Because humans aren't built just to avoid pain. They're built to experience connection. And when you remove connection to stay safe, you also remove the very thing that makes life feel meaningful. So what starts as protection slowly becomes a kind of emotional starvation. You still function. You still move forward. You might even convince yourself that this is who you are now, someone who prefers distance, someone who doesn't need anyone. But then there are moments. Small, quiet moments that slip through the cracks. A message you almost send, but don't. A memory that lingers longer than it should, a feeling that something is missing, even when everything seems fine. And that's the part most people never talk about. Cutting people off doesn't just remove the risk of being hurt, it also removes the chance of being healed through others. Because not every connection is meant to repeat the past. But when your mind is wired to expect the same ending, it stops recognizing new possibilities. It treats every person like a familiar story, even when they're trying to write something different with you. And this is where the shift begins, not by forcing yourself to suddenly trust everyone, not by pretending the past didn't shape you, but by gently questioning the belief that every ending has to look the same. What if leaving isn't the only form of protection? What if staying with boundaries is a different kind of strength? Because the truth is, the version of you that learned to walk away wasn't wrong. It was intelligent. It was adaptive. It did exactly what it needed to do to survive moments where staying meant losing yourself. But survival strategies aren't always meant to be permanent identities. At some point, what once protected you can begin to limit you. And healing doesn't mean removing your boundaries. It means refining them. It means learning the difference between someone who drains you and someone who simply doesn't understand you yet. It means giving people small chances instead of none at all. Not blind trust, but gradual openness. Not complete vulnerability, but honest communication in pieces. Because connection doesn't require you to abandon yourself. It requires you to include yourself fully without shrinking. And yes, that will feel unfamiliar at first, maybe even uncomfortable. Because you're no longer operating from fear, you're operating from awareness. You'll notice when you want to withdraw. You'll feel that instinct to disappear. But instead of acting on it immediately, you pause. You ask yourself, is this the present? Or is this my past speaking again? And in that small pause, something changes. You create space between what you feel and what you choose. That space is where healing lives, not in forcing yourself to stay in situations that harm you, but in recognizing that not every discomfort is danger. Some discomfort is growth. Some awkward conversations lead to deeper understanding. Some misunderstandings can be repaired instead of abandoned. And slowly, as you allow yourself to experience connection without immediately preparing for its ending, something softens. The invisible wall doesn't collapse overnight, but it begins to crack. Light starts to come through. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, you realize that connection doesn't have to feel like a risk you're always losing. It can feel like something you're learning step by step. And there will still be moments when you step back. Moments when distance is necessary, but now it's a choice, not a reflex. A boundary, not an escape. And that changes everything. Because you're no longer someone who cuts everyone off to survive. You're someone who chooses carefully, who stays when it's healthy, and leaves when it's truly needed. There's a quiet power in that, a kind of balance that doesn't come from fear, but from understanding yourself deeply enough to know when to open and when to protect. And maybe the most important realization of all is that the world isn't just made of people who will misunderstand you. It's also made of people who are trying, in their own imperfect ways, to meet you where you are. But they can only reach you if you don't disappear before they get the chance. So, maybe healing doesn't start with letting everyone in. Maybe it starts with letting one moment last a little longer than usual. One reply sent instead of ignored. One honest sentence instead of silent withdrawal. One decision to stay just a little longer than your fear expects. Because behind that fear isn't just pain. There's also the possibility of something you've been quietly missing. And if this story felt familiar, if somewhere in these words you recognized a part of yourself you've been trying to understand, then maybe this isn't the end of your pattern. Maybe it's the beginning of noticing it. And noticing is where everything begins to change. If this story resonated with you, just know you were never meant to carry all of this alone. And maybe, slowly, gently, you don't have to anymore.